And as you can see from their views, that as I've mentioned already, this approach is a teleological approach. Now we have encountered teleological approach even in Aristotle. The idea that any action or any art or any inquiry that we carried out is carried out towards some purpose or towards some end. Here you're getting a more specific sense of what that end is. That end is pursuit of pleasure, maximizing our pleasure and minimizing our pain or avoidance of pain. So here too we have a situation where we have any act or anything that we do, any act, any art, any inquiry that we carry out is towards the end of deriving pleasure from it and avoiding pain. So what you have, here already is this sense of a pursuit of an action which benefits oneself, while the hedonists have defined that benefit in terms of um, pleasure. Egoists more generally define those benefits in define those benefits in terms of self-interest. Another way of putting it is they define self-interest in more general terms than just simply limited to immediate pleasures. And egoism also argues that humans tend to act on safeguarding their own interest. Now, we'll briefly touch on two types of egoism. One is ethical egoism that I've already referred to a little bit, and other might be called psychological egoism, sort of a more descriptive idea of egoism. Let's have a look. So, so psychological egoism basically assumes that human nature is such that it compels or makes us egoists. Human nature, it compels human beings to be egoist, that the egoist nature of human beings reflect their psychology, which perceives and tries to maximize individual self-interest. That egoistic choices and actions are not necessarily based on some form of moral reasoning, but merely an aspect of our psychological makeup. By our psychological makeup, by the very way of we as human beings think and operate, we focus on our own individual self interest. Now, without passing any moral or ethical judgment here. That's how we are. That human beings, by their psychological makeup, pursue their self interest. Ethical egoism is going further than that. Because they're saying everyone ought to always do those acts that best serve his or her own self interest. Our moral obligation is to seek out our own self interest. Any action is morally right if it produces more good and fewer bad consequences for us. So, for an ethical egoist, it is the morally binding thing on all humans. So, you see the distinction here. In the first part, psychological egoists are saying it's a part of our human nature. That's how we are, regardless of what moral judgment you want to pass on this. Ethical egoists are going further than that and saying it's a morally binding value on us to pursue our own self interest. Now, critics have pointed out certain important drawbacks to this ethical egoist approach. Now, some have noted, for example, that ethical egoism is not able to provide any answers or any moral evaluation or judgment when, for example, there's a conflict of interest between two individuals, let's say, or more. But if you have two individuals pursuing their own self interest and these self interests collide, and in this situation only one can have what she desires, the doctrine of ethical egoism fails to show us the right direction or the right decision or the right way to resolve this. If one individual, for example, tries to gain what he or she wants and in the process harms the other individual, the other person can also do the same to secure her own interests. Here, ethical egoism seems to be unable to arrive at any kind of moral judgment or moral evaluation, or even resolve this conflict of interest, which many ethicists would argue is precisely one of the things a moral theory should be doing. That without an ability to arrive at such a judgment in these types of situations. What we have is a fully relativized situation where each individual believes in his or her own interests and goes about doing whatever is good for his or her own self, leading to all sorts of conflicts which we cannot morally resolve. Now, this also introduces a sense, many argue, uh, a sort of inconsistency in moral counsel. Because then we'll be guided by something else. At one point, we could uh, agree that this person's interest matters more than the other person's interest. Why? Because we may be biased more towards this person or favor the interest they are pursuing and not like the other person or not like their actions and so on. Um, in other contexts, it could be merely, we are unaware of all the information and so on. So we may decide that this seems right and so on. So, overall, taken together, many argue that this kind of ethical egoism undermines the very notion of a moral evaluation, moral judgment, or a moral point of view. And by this, what they generally tend to mean or imply is that morality must have something to do with the impartial attitude of someone who tries to see all sides of an issue without necessarily, being committed to the interest of one particular person or one particular group. You know. Many ethicists, as I just mentioned, emphasize that this sort of a impartial moral point of view is a necessary element in any kind of ethical theory or any sort of notion of morality. Indeed, one sort of common association with this sort of morality has been this notion of the perspective of an ideal observer or an impartial judge. You know, Many ethicists would argue, or even many common, we might, each of us might think that an ideal observer must have certain key characteristics. That the ideal observer who can adjudicate between two different viewpoints or a conflict between two should be impartial or unbiased. Nor, she should not treat either of their positions or her own position as a special case. The ideal observer should be impartial in considering what she should do, as she would be in deciding what someone else would do in her case. The second aspect that comes up, we'll encounter this again later when we look at utilitarians. An ideal observer also has to have full knowledge of all the facts and viewpoints if she is going to decide among different viewpoints that are in conflict. It's almost argued that the ideal observer should be able to identify with any person involved in this situation. This So this is what we were. In order to be sort of an ideal moral judge, one needs to firstly not take anyone's side, including her own biases should not come into this, should have full knowledge of the facts involved, and should be able to empathize with either person's viewpoint. Only when we're able to do so, and in addition, one can add the ideal person should also be able to decide between what is morally a right or wrong action. Only when we are able to do so, we can say that the person is an impartial judge. Now, if you take this viewpoint, in anyone, and a proponent of ethical egoism clearly cannot be an impartial judge because he or she is favoring her own self-interest, which may or may not be consistent with this sort of impartial view of a moral uh, perspective. So, in other words, if you take this viewpoint that human beings are psychologically programmed to be egoists, then they can never take on selfless act towards other, nor can they ever be fully impartial or unbiased. You know, because they will always favor their own self-interest. So then the question does arrive: is such a moral view even realistic? An ethical egoist could argue that no one can be completely impartial or disinterested. Some might even argue that trying to figure out or approximate the perspective of an ideal observer is a surefire way to moral indecision or inaction or passivity, because we will never be able to arrive at a fully impartial decision. So instead of engaging in issues of the day, the so-called ideal observer would find himself or herself unable to actually provide a judgment here. So what we see, basically we've got ourselves all twisted here. If you take a look, on the one hand, you have this ethical perspective of egoism, which says do what promotes your own self-interest. Then a critic comes along and says, but if everybody does this and their self-interests come into collision with each other, how do you resolve that problem? you know so a moral uh, ethicist, uh, or from the perspective of morality, someone could respond, well, what would really matter here is the view of someone who's unbiased, who won't let his or her own interests or the interests of the people in conflict with each other affect the outcome or the judgment. So one has to be impartial and unbiased in order be able to put oneself in both persons' shoes or both group shoes in order to arrive at an impartial decision. But then the ethical egoist might try to counter that by saying, well, is that kind of impartial decision ever possible? No. Firstly, we may never have full knowledge of all the facts and viewpoints. And secondly, no one is ever completely impartial or disinterested. And all this would just lead to uh, a sort of moral indecision or inaction, you know, inability to actually arrive at a solution. So, if you take the ethical perspective of egoism, that it always favors self interest, then it is not consistent with the moral point of view. That is what the ethical egoists are getting at. And we will turn to a, uh, an ethical egoist who goes beyond mere hedonism, who makes such a viewpoint and therefore looks for other ways of resolving this conflict between different individual self interests.